be in a University of Connecticut Law Review article probably early next year, and much of the rest is in a book that you can find copies of out here on the table by me. It came out last year. Unfortunately, because it's about the problem of mass murder, there wasn't much interest in it. Anyway, what I'm going to be speaking about today is the problem of mass murder, the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill, and gun control. What are the connections? What are the causes? What are the solutions? First of all, this will not be any great surprise to you, but every mass murder leads to calls for more gun control. It is something of an understandable reaction, but it's missing what is, I consider, a rather important cause for why these mass murders have become such a problem in the last 30 years, along with a whole bunch of other social problems, some of which I will address as well. A decision in the 1960s to adopt the policy of deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill. Now, there's always been a few mass murders in the United States, even as far back as colonial times. I've read quite a number of accounts of colonial mass murders. They're often done with a knife, with a hatchet, or an axe, even occasionally mass murders with guns, even in colonial times. Sometimes in our history, they have been organized crime killings, such as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929. Far more commonly, when mass murders have taken place in the U.S., they have usually been domestic violence. A man despairing over economic hardships kills his wife and children and then himself, or a woman, sometimes suffering from postpartum depression, kills her children and then herself. Even today, the domestic violence mass murders are far more common and far less publicized than the public random mass murders, such as happened in Newtown at the Navy Yard. This chart here shows a breakdown of incidents where more than 4 people have been killed in a single crime since 2006. As you can see, there have been 112 family violence mass murders in that period, and oddly enough, a lot of them do not involve guns. They involve stabbing, blunt force, fire. By comparison, there have been 36 of these random public mass murders. Interestingly enough, mass murders that are part of a robbery or a burglary are almost as common and yet receive almost no attention. Now, I doubt very many of you have seen much coverage of the domestic violence mass murders, but you've all seen enormous coverage of the random acts of public mass murder. There's a reason for this. While all of these crimes are tragedies, most people are not particularly freaked out by the domestic violence mass murders or the robbery burglary mass murders. The very comforting theory is that if you live in a nice part of town and you aren't part of a dysfunctional family situation, you're probably not much at risk. And therefore, people just tend not to pay much attention. By comparison, the random public mass murders, they are a tiny fraction of 1% of U.S. murders. They're actually quite unusual, and yet they provoke an enormous amount of fear, and often quite irrational legislative responses. And it's precisely because they are random. Victims have usually no connection at all to the killer. They don't know the person, who is often severely mentally ill. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that sense of randomness, of having no control over it, it's really scary. It makes people do silly things. Now, these random public mass murders used to be relatively rare. In fact, used to be extraordinarily rare. Some of you in this room are old enough to remember 1966 when Charles Whitman murdered 17 people out of the Texas Tower. He was from Texas, down Texas, obviously. Americans were shocked. This was completely outside of our experience. Starting with James Huberty's slaughter in a McDonald's in San Ysidro in 1982, suddenly these things started to happen with increasing frequency. Now, we haven't had any increase in frequency in the last few years. We've just sort of gotten used to them, and that in itself is a tragedy. Now, the other important thing to understand is these tragedies are not just because of American gun culture. They are actually happening across the industrialized world and often in countries with fairly strict gun control laws, certainly stricter than ours. However, they have followed us down the same public policy road about how to deal with the mentally ill. What an interesting coincidence. Europe has a lot of these public mass murders. For example, Anders Breivik, who murdered 77 people in Norway 2 years ago and wounded 242. He was found schizophrenic by the psychiatrists, but still legally sane. The Hungerford and Dunblane mass murders in Britain a few years ago. Mass murders in France, Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. All of these countries have had a surprising number of mass murders considering both their populations and the strictness of their gun control laws. And it turns out that there are strong similarities in the people that commit these mass murders across multiple countries. Now, the common characteristic of most of these random mass murders is the person who does it has a severe mental illness problem. In 2000, the New York Times, not exactly one of our friends, did a survey. They studied 100 of what they called rampage killers. And they found that 47 of them had a history of clearly documented mental health problems. 20 had been previously hospitalized for those problems. 42 had seen professionals for those mental health problems. The words in the New York Times described that the mental health system had provided them, quote, insufficient or inconsistent treatment, unquote. Now, it's quite likely that many of the 53 who did not have a clear history of mental illness were probably mentally ill. Not everyone with really serious problems actually goes to seek help or comes to the attention of the authorities. And I'd also like to point out that someone who puts often considerable time and effort into planning the mass murder of complete strangers, often followed by his own suicide, is probably not exactly right in the head. Now, the other thing that's unfortunate is that the pattern has not changed. Most of the mass murderers subsequent to 2000, not only here but in Europe as well, have had well-established serious mental illness problems. Sonohoy Cho in Virginia Tech killer, James Holmes in Aurora, Gerald Lee Loner, who shot Representative Giffords and killed 6 others in Tucson, Aaron Alexis, who murdered 12 people at the Navy Yard. These are all people who had well-established histories of mental illness, were recognized by many people around them, in some cases by psychiatrists who were trying to get them help. Even ones who are not clearly psychotic, such as the shooter at Newtown, had diagnoses that sound suspiciously like a doctor was trying to avoid or was delaying the devastating diagnosis of schizophrenia. Now, a few examples, even hundreds of examples, don't really prove the connection, but they do give credence to the multiple large-scale studies that show that severely mentally ill disproportionately commit violent crimes, especially murder. While they get very little attention, it is not just these public mass murders. There's all sorts of the murders that only 1 or 2 people die, and so they don't get any attention outside of the town where they take place. Multiple countries from the 1970s onward have shown that mentally ill persons are far more likely to be arrested for felonies, and especially for murder. One fairly extreme example, San Mateo County, California, 1972. People with mental illness histories were 82.5 times more likely to be arrested than you would expect for their proportion of the population. Studies of inmates in jails, prisons, both state and federal, also find very disproportionate numbers of the mentally ill are present in them. 16% of state prisoners, for example, state prison inmates. There's a study of Indiana murder convicts that was completed in 2008 using data from 1999, where they found that 18% of the murder convicts were severely mentally ill, suffering from schizophrenia or some other psychotic disorder, mania, bipolar disorder, and a couple of other serious problems. One particular category, schizophrenia, was about 3.5 times more likely to be a murder convict than you would expect for their proportion of the population. Now, it's just possible that looking at people who've been arrested and convicted, it may be that, maybe the police and the criminal justice system are just picking on mentally ill people. Or maybe they're less effective at defending themselves in the court system. But there are other studies that have been done of general populations where they have taken a large group of volunteers, given them a mental evaluation, and asked them to self-report on violent behavior. And again, they find that some categories of the population are disproportionately violent. People with major affective disorder or schizophrenia are roughly 5.5 times more violent than the general population. The only group worse are those with alcohol or drug addiction disorders, who are typically about 11 times more violent, which I'm hoping that won't be a surprise to anyone. And even this study may understate the level of violence because getting most seriously mentally ill people to voluntarily participate in a study like this, well, I think you can see why there might be some difficulties getting someone who thinks that you work for the CIA and your objective is to find out all about them to go ahead and participate in the survey. Now, we have a number of other ways of examining the problem. Professor Steven Seagal, no, not the actor, at UC Berkeley published a study 2 years ago where he examined state-to-state variations in murder rates and a number of different possible explanations, one of which was quality of mental health care. He looked at things like age and race, density of population, policing percentages, and so differences in the mental health systems from state to state. He found that about 20% of the state-to-state difference in murder rates could be explained by the availability of psychiatric hospital beds. The more beds that were available, the fewer the murders. He found that 27% of the state-to-state difference in murder rates was correlated with variations in how difficult or how easy it was to have someone involuntarily committed for a serious mental illness problem. Generally, the easier it was to involuntarily commit, the fewer murders there were. I hope, again, that isn't too much of a surprise. Someone who thinks that aliens have taken over the earth and so therefore kills and eats the person next to him on the bus, like happened in Manitoba in 2008, yeah, there's a connection there, I think. Bernard Harcourt of University of Chicago, who is, by the way, generally not pro-gun, he used a rather different approach. He looked at murder rates for this fairly long period of the 20th century, which is the dotted line on this graph, and then he plotted it against a number of different social science measures that sociologists use to try to explain crime. And he found that better than any other explanation, what he called the total institutionalization rate, black line, turned out to be the best predictor of murder rates. Total institutionalization is what percentage of the population is locked up in either a mental hospital, a jail, or a prison. As mental hospitals were emptied in the 1960s and 1970s, wow, murder rates started to rise. In the 1980s and 1990s, as states passed increasingly strict laws about mandatory minimums and longer sentences, the percentage that was locked up went up, and the percentage that was committing murder went down. So, quite interesting. Now, admittedly, none of these mental patients were not going into mental hospitals. They were going into prisons. So, you're probably wondering, what is deinstitutionalization? Most people have only a limited understanding. They think it's something that started with the Reagan administration. It was actually one of those well-intentioned efforts that really did not work all that well, at least not the way it was supposed to. Many state hospitals into the 1950s were really pretty horrible places. There had been funding shortages because of the Depression and World War II, and these hospitals had serious shortages of staff and space, and they had really quite inhumane crowding problems. Worse, a lot of these hospitals were primarily custodial institutions. At the time, a lot of the patients in state mental hospitals were the elderly senile, and there was nowhere else to put them yet. Or they were people suffering from syphilitic insanity, which we don't even think about that anymore because penicillin pretty much made syphilis go away as a major problem. The other problem is that until some of the antipsychotic medications like chlorpromazine were introduced in 1954, for many of the patients that were in these hospitals, they were so violent that the only choices for how to deal with them were straitjackets, shock treatment, or prefrontal lobotomies, where you go in and cut the frontal lobes of the brain, make them somewhat semi-vegetative. And even for patients that were not violent, there was a belief, probably as later evidence shows, correct, that those who were not curable, they were probably safer in the hospital than they were wandering the streets. So how was deinstitutionalization accomplished? It started in 1963 with a order from President John Kennedy that encouraged the states to start emptying their hospitals. And it was successful. Many of the state mental hospitals were largely emptied out. to roughly 1/5 the number today that we had back in 1955. In fact, we have less capacity in our state mental hospitals today per capita than we did in 1850. The promise was these patients were all going to be returned to the community for community mental health center outpatient treatment. And there were some for whom it worked just fine. But there were quite a number of others for whom it did not work out. Those with the most severe illnesses, those with paranoid schizophrenia, like my older brother, they were hearing voices and seeing things that the rest of us could not see or hear. They refused to show up for appointments or take their antipsychotic medications. They were living on park benches, in alleys, on steam grates in freezing weather, and homelessness, which had been fairly much a non-problem in American cities up to this point. Suddenly, in the late 1970s, it becomes an issue. This graph here shows how books that use the word homelessness start to increase dramatically in the early 1980s. It takes a little while for all of these authors to figure out, oh, we have an issue here. We have a problem we need to be concerned about. Unfortunately, very few people at the time were prepared to admit what multiple studies that were then being completed were showing, which is the homeless were overwhelmingly suffering from severe mental illness, the people that had been previously hospitalized. Some samples showed as much as 90% of these homeless people were severely mentally ill. Much of the rest were dependents, wives and children of these severely mentally ill people. One of the more depressing things that I found while doing this book was the rate of people who freeze to death in America more than doubled between 1974 and 1984. Death by exposure, malnutrition, sometimes intentional self-starvation became much more common. Another depressing item I found was the Portland Oregonian newspaper in 2001 did a series of studies of self-harm by the homeless mentally ill and found that dozens who had starved themselves to death because they were convinced that they could feel or hear their skin sizzling if they drank or ate anything. And police, family, mental health workers, by Oregon law, were prohibited from intervening because at no point were they in imminent danger of death. And that was the standard that Oregon law then and now still requires for involuntary commitment. Another part of how deinstitutionalization was implemented was a series of lawsuits, largely by the ACLU in the 1970s. They fundamentally changed how civil commitment was done. Before 1970, in most of the United States, a preponderance of evidence, just the majority of the evidence, suggests that this person is mentally ill and would benefit from treatment. That was enough to persuade a judge to go ahead and hospitalize this person for treatment. This was a civil procedure. It was not a criminal procedure. The government was acting in its traditional role of parens patriae. Basically, government is the father of the country. They're looking out for those who could not care for themselves. Now, it's true that some of the state laws up to this point were defective in some aspects of due process. Maine, in some respects, didn't even have due process at all. It was theoretically possible to be locked up on one person's say-so for life. But most of these defects could have been corrected without destroying the system and leading to the murder problem that we have come to live with. The U.S. Supreme Court in Addington v. Texas makes a pretty major change. They say that the preponderance of evidence standard of proof for mental illness commitment is not enough. From now on, it will be a much stricter requirement. There has to be clear and convincing evidence that a patient is a danger to self and others. And one of the consequences of that was to encourage laws like most American states have today. From what I have been able to find in news accounts, James Holmes, a psychiatrist here in Colorado, knew that there was something seriously wrong, that he was probably dangerous, and that she had made some contacts to the police about this. The problem is from my review of Colorado law, I can see why the police weren't interested in taking any action. He was not an imminent danger to self or others, and he had not been previously hospitalized, two of the possible strategies by which he could have been locked up. One of the consequences of that was that he was not taken into custody. If he had been involuntarily committed, his name would have been sent to the national background check system, and he would have been unable to purchase a gun from a licensed dealer. Instead, by the time he was in imminent danger to others, there was blood everywhere in the theater. Now he can take it into custody. Other lawsuits by the ACLU had the effect of making it so expensive to operate